Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here today. Hey, today on the show, we've got a special guest. This is somebody I ran across on YouTube just maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, and I found his content, and I found it really interesting, really helpful, challenging, very challenging, especially to the liberal regime, kind of the modern era we live in. And so today on the show, I'm glad to have Auron MacIntyre. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Auron.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
So, Oren, you are a host for the Blaze show, Auron MacIntyre Show. Is that correct?
Yeah. Auron MacIntyre Show. It's on Blaze TV. It's on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, podcasts, all the platforms you'd expect.
All the places. All right, great. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And how long have you been doing that?
Well, I've been running the YouTube channel here now for a little over 2 years, but I joined the Blaze about 7 months ago now, so still pretty new over there.
Okay, cool. So what kind of inspired you to get into the YouTube space to start kind of offering your perspective or, takes on philosophy and politics and that kind of thing?
Well, I'd always been really interested in politics. I got a degree in political science. I was a political reporter, and I worked in kind of Florida politics for a while. But kind of as I saw the 2016 election and then everything that happened in 2020, I kind of realized, okay, politics doesn't work anything like the way it was actually described to me. And I kind of want to understand why it doesn't do that and how it actually works. And so I started reading different political philosophers, different theories that I had never really explored before. And as I did that, I started making YouTube videos about it, and here we are.
Yeah, that's great. I think there might be a lot of people in your position who maybe either get into politics or they start dabbling in the political stuff and they're like, this doesn't seem to be working like how I've been taught. Like we were taught a certain way of, representative government, and, it's all supposed to be pretty peaceful in terms of, you do your vote and you accept the consequences, and it just kind of goes on, and everybody kind of agrees that we live in a pluralistic democracy. What were some things, 'cause I think my listeners might identify with where you were at the time. What were some things that tipped you off to let you know, hey, things don't really seem to work as I've been told?
Well, the first thing was working as a journalist. I didn't have a journalism degree. I hadn't trained in it. So I was really coming in from the outside. It was kind of a series of odd events that ended up landing me in that position. But once I got inside the bubble and I started showing up to these political rallies, showing up to these press gaggles for different people, I watched how journalists actually shaped events. I got to see how the things that were said inside the bubble and the things that were actually being done were vastly different from how they were being reported, and that how they were reported really shaped things more than the facts on the ground. And then 2020 happened. We saw, of course, the COVID pandemic lockdowns. We saw kind of the summer of George Floyd. And that's where things really fell apart for me, because I said, okay, churches are closed. People are burning down cities. You're locked in your home. Your business is being destroyed by people just because they happen to be on the right team. All the libertarians and conservatives who had told me for decades that, like, this is what the Second Amendment was for, that, like, at the end of the day, the Bill of Rights would protect us from all of this stuff. The First Amendment would keep our religious liberties, but none of that happened. None of it was protected. And all of a sudden I realized, okay, actually the Constitution is just dead and everybody's pretending like it's not. Why is that the case? What is happening?
Yeah, 2020 was definitely a year for those kind of evaluations. I definitely can resonate with that. In terms of your own kind of background, you are part of a church down there in Florida. What was your experience like in church during that time? Was your church able to stay open, or did they have to comply with some kind of edicts from on high?
The good news in Florida is that obviously we had Governor DeSantis. I know a lot of people, are in the big DeSantis-Trump shootout right now. I personally have my own feelings about DeSantis. I think he should stay here and keep being governor because he's really good at it, and I prefer that. But all credit to him. He really fought in a moment. I mean, we had some lockdowns. We had one pastor in the Tampa area arrested for trying to put on a church service, though that was more due to local law at the moment than it was the governor. But after I think kind of everyone realized what was going on, DeSantis pushed back really hard, and that meant that most organizations, schools, churches, everybody were able to open up much faster here than anyone else.
That's great. Yeah, those are some of my thoughts on DeSantis too. When I've talked with people, my friends, people in my church, and they just want to hear my thoughts because we have a pretty open dialogue, I feel like, at our church about these matters. And I'm like, dude, I would love to see DeSantis just stay in Florida, become the king of Florida,
Yeah.
and just own it. You know, just keep pushing the wins he's got already, push them forward, like make it complete. But obviously, he has different aspirations there. Um, the reason I wanted to get you on the show is because one episode you did, it's Conquest Laws. If you want to go find it, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I think it's Robert Conquest Laws.
Mhm.
And I listened to it because you talked about right wing and how any organization that's not right wing, and just some of my own experience in this with my wife's business, with our church, and other kind of things. And I see these corporations going left. Um, it resonated. It was very like evident to me that these were just kind of true, and yet I still like I'm haunted by this kind of fantasy world of a neutral public square, and like that seems a little too aggressive. So I was wondering if you could introduce my listeners to those laws and maybe give some background on where they came from.
Sure. So Robert Conquest is a historian and a poet. He was a fellow, worked in the university system for a very long time. And he had two laws that are well known to him, and then a third one that kind of got added later. It's hard to track the actual kind of source of these because apparently these are informal. They were never actually written down in any of his mini books on things like the Soviet Union. They kind of emerged out of his different lectures and those kind of things. So many people sat through his lectures, referenced the laws, but you won't find them written down in some kind of overarching book of philosophy. And so the two laws that are Conquest's his own are everyone is conservative about what he knows best. And the simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's controlled by a cabal of its enemies. And then later on, Conquest added what's commonly known as O'Sullivan's Law, which is any organization that is not explicitly right wing sooner or later becomes left wing. And those three laws together, while they may not immediately seem particularly profound or connected, form what is kind of a historical case for leftism or progressivism as entropy, as kind of the way in which order is slowly broken down over time. And so a lot of people, particularly guys like Curtis Yarvin, and Nick Land, two political philosophers from kind of the more neo-reactionary school of political philosophy, from which I draw a lot of kind of inspiration, have popularized these laws again and made them kind of well known amongst a lot of people who are thinking about these issues. And I think they're really compelling for people because if you look closely at kind of the world around us, we see a pattern that repeats over and over and over again that kind of falls under Conquest laws.
Okay, so let's go ahead and start with leftism. When we talk about leftism, as a pastor, I don't know that I've used the phrase leftism. I've used the word communism in a sermon. I've used the word neo-Marxism and Marxism in sermons, but I haven't used the word leftism, and I've been trying to figure out if it's even appropriate. But in order to do that, that's why I've got you on the show. In order to do that, help me understand when you say leftism, what are you talking about?
Sure. So a lot of people like to use communism or like you said, neo-Marxism, those things. And there's nothing specifically wrong with kind of understanding those things at a certain level. If by that you mean communism is just the way by which people destroy kind of that which is good and natural hierarchies so that they can secure power.
Hmm.
The problem is that a lot of people confuse communism and Marxism like with the actual discrete economic prescriptions of Karl Marx.
Right.
And the state owns the means of production, these kind of things. And so when people kind of casually throw around Marxism, it kind of loses what it means. It's like when the left throws around fascism, right? Like everything is fascist. Everything I don't like is fascist. It's like, well, no,
Sure.
actually, fascism is a very discrete and specific historical philosophy of government. that hasn't really existed in any meaningful way since World War II. And so just saying anything that disagrees slightly with, kind of radical left-wing ideology is fascism isn't very helpful. And I think the same is kind of true of communism. It gets abused in that way. Again, not to say that I don't understand what people are saying when they say it. I just think it makes it hard to understand. So this is why I tend to use progressivism more than anything else, or or leftist ideology. But we all know it when we see it, right? That's the thing about it. It's like, it's we all know when we see it, and it's this idea that we need to destroy natural hierarchies, that things like the church, that things like the family, things that are naturally substantiated inside our culture, that are building blocks, bedrocks of Western Christendom, need to be slowly but surely unwound in order to kind of create this hedonistic utopia, secular utopia that a lot of people on the left are pushing for.
Okay, that's great. That makes sense. Yeah, and that's something I've really come to appreciate about God's word and about the created order, especially in the last 2 years. Before that, I was fairly, I would say, complementarian in terms of, if we want to dial in on one issue, men and women in the church. And when you just look at the Bible, it's the egalitarian kind of modern idea that, there is no hierarchy is not found there. And so we tend to import and practice eisegesis in the Bible, reading into the Bible when Jesus talks about, loving your enemy and that kind of thing. We tend to flatten it out, read into the Bible our modern ideas of egalitarianism and even leftism, progressivism. So that's really helpful. One of the laws that just on its face, I think is easy. Let's start with the easiest one for people to kind of understand is everyone is conservative about what they know best. So tell me more about that and how that makes sense.
Sure. So when we say conservative here, it's important to realize we don't mean like American politically conservative. When we say conservative here, we literally just mean protecting and defending, conserving something. So you can be conservative about your Marxism. You can be, in fact, many classically Marxist people, like actual Marxist radicals, hate modern progressivism because it's really not Marxist at all in many ways. It discards most of the Marxist economic doctrine and completely embraces things like woke capital, and they are conservative about their Marxism. So basically the idea is we tend to be conservative about the things we are closest to and reliant upon. We do not want those things to change. And so naturally, when we are next to something, when we're reliant on something, when it is part of our day-to-day existence, we do not want to see it in constant upheaval. It is the things that are more abstract, that are more distant from us, on which we do not rely, that we are more willing to allow change to occur inside of.
Yeah, I see that a lot in Boulder with you get a lot of NIMBYs in our town with people who promote kind of progressivism, but then when it comes down to putting the homeless shelter in their backyard, they're very opposed to it, or any kind of resources in town. It hasn't become Portland for that reason because these people are fairly conservative about their own backyard and they don't want things to change. So I think that makes sense for anyone. If you're a carpenter or if you're in any industry or anything like that, that's just patently true. You don't want disruption. You want to be the expert in the field. You want control and you want to conserve what you've got. So the next one that is interesting to me because I can be a fairly cynical person and I've been trying to, in the Lord, resist the darker forms of cynicism. I want to be more of a realist. I want to be hopeful in the Lord. But this law talks about you should assume basically that the your enemy is or you're controlled by a cabal of your enemies. Is that how it goes again?
So it depends on which one you're looking at. If you're looking at the kind of the lineup here, the second one is usually any organization not explicitly right wing is sooner or later left wing.
Okay.
And that's the one that's O'Sullivan's law. That's the one that kind of got borrowed from a journalist, John O'Sullivan. But that one is really noticing the tendency that there is a continuous left wing drift to things naturally over time. So, for instance, the example that like Curtis Yarvin gives is like, look at somebody like Ben Shapiro, right? Ben Shapiro, flamethrower, right? Like right wing guy, blah blah blah, crazy. If you want to, find some progressive and shake a boogeyman at them, like who's the most dangerous man in the world you can think of? They're thinking of somebody like Ben Shapiro, right? But take Ben Shapiro and put him in like the average conservative neighborhood 50 years ago. Ben Shapiro's pretty liberal in that neighborhood. Actually, he's actually pretty liberal. And if we take the most radical guy from the 1950s, the most radical 1950s conservative, and we pick him up and we put him in a place in like the 1890s, he's super liberal, right? And so we notice over time that things continually get more and more left wing, and the question we want to ask is why, right? Like, why is this an observable phenomenon over time when the left talks about the long arc of history pointing towards progressivism in some way? They aren't actually wrong, and we want to grasp why that happens.
Yeah, so as a theologian and pastor, I'm trying to connect it, and I wonder how much leftism is rooted in the fall, because Satan coming to the garden tempting Eve was an overthrow of hierarchy. It was an inversion, a perversion of the natural hierarchy of God, Adam, Eve, created order over which they were to have dominion. And then Satan comes in, the created order, the creature comes in and flips it on its head. And so I can connect it there. Do you think that leftism in its modern iteration, this drift leftward, do you think it's traceable throughout history? Like, could we look at Egypt? Could we look at other nations as well? Or do you think it's a modern phenomenon?
I think that it is something traceable throughout history. I think if we look at history, the history of civilizations tends to be cyclical. When we look at civilizations, they tend to start because there's an animating metaphysical force, a force that is drawn from the character of the people and their religious beliefs and their traditions, and that is what kind of constructs and drives the civilization. And then once the civilization kind of conquers its external enemies, it tends to start slowly unraveling those traditions. Once there's, people lean on these things because they have power, but they also have power because they restrict who the people can be and what they are. And part of our sinful nature is we don't want to be restricted. We want to be as gods. We want to choose for ourselves what we will be. And so the power of these animating stories, these metaphysical movements, is that they bind us together into one collective vision of who we are and what we should be. And they help us to overcome difficult times. But then once we don't have difficult times anymore, people say, but did we really need to do this? Like, but did God really say, and then slowly but surely, piece by piece, little bits fall apart until we've completely unwound, and to the point where now we're kind of in this, this radical degeneration. But again, I think that's an observable truth about human nature and civilizations, that is not particular to our current moment. Every civilization will have a different manifestation of this. Ours is particularly, of course, Christian, and particularly Western, and particularly American. But I think that we can see this very often over and over again, right? The Jewish people, God saves them from something. They come together. They are animated by this. They do something great, and then, well, but now we don't really need. Maybe we could worship another guy. Maybe we can make a calf. This is a recurring pattern.
No, that's a great example because I just preached on Judges yesterday, Judges 6. And, in Judges, there is a cycle that happens almost in every chapter, but every judge that comes, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after they had rest in the land for 40 years, whatever it was. And so there, you could definitely apply this principle there. One question I want to drill down on in this law particularly is the terminology right wing, leftism, that kind of thing. For the average layman, the person in the pews, that can be a really hard not pill to swallow, but just like concept to grasp, because we live in such a sensitive, or I don't know, just people don't like the phrase right wing, left wing. People want to imagine Jesus is above that or not that. So how do you help when you're talking to people in your church, or you're just talking to people? How do you help them understand? Because if I got up and I said our church is a right wing church, I don't know if that's the most prudent thing. I don't see any pastor doing that in church history. I can't imagine myself ever doing that. So if you go to the well and you're listening to this, that's probably not going to happen. However, how can we understand the principle here and flesh it out for people in churches, for Christians, to equip them to think cogently and soberly about these things?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. So, uh, I think it's really important, like now more than ever, for church to be a different sphere, a different social sphere apart from the political. I think that one of the key problems, one of the reasons that churches don't have the kind of power and they aren't doing the kind of work that they used to, is because they are part of the state. They are embroiled in matters, and that doesn't mean like there are very clear political implications from Christian doctrine and Christian faith. There are just things that you cannot pretend are not directly connected to these things. But we should remember that those things should only be political because those things should only be enacted in politics because they are first Christian principles. They are first doctrines of the church. The church is not political. Politics might need to reflect the values of church, but the church, I don't want to go to church and hear we're a right wing church, right? Like obviously, like this is what I do,
Yeah.
but that is not what church is for. That is not what being called to follow Christ is about. There will be implications, very real ones, about kind of how we then conduct ourselves in a political sphere as followers of Christ. But I don't think the church is something that should be right wing or left wing in that sense. When we're saying right wing and left wing here, we're not really talking about like the tennis court oath. We're not going back to the French Revolution, and we're also not talking about like current American, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. What we're talking about is really pronomian and antinomian. We're talking about pro norms, pro hierarchy, pro order and structure, and anti hierarchy, anti structure, flattening, leveling. And so when we say when organizations are explicitly right wing, what we mean are explicitly pro order, pro hierarchy. And when we say become left wing, we mean eventually devolve into a flattening, an egalitarianism, an attack on hierarchy. That's really what we're talking about in these.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think with churches and evangelicalism as a whole, I've seen this trend play out. That's why I'm so fascinated by it. It's part of the reason I got more animated in 2020, was because I saw these organizations, these churches, these denominations becoming more egalitarian in the broadest sense of the word, and less hierarchical. In fact, it was seen as good, whether in the missional movement or other movements, to kind of have a very flat organizational structure. Everybody's the same. And then we take Luther's priesthood of all believers and we bathe it in kind of this, leftism. And then there is no order in the church. Well, pastor, you don't have any authority over me. The elders have no authority over me. We're all the same. I'm a priest too. And so I've seen this play out. I think one of the most tangible places for people to see it, though, it may not be their churches. Although if you look under the hood, a lot of churches are drifting this direction because they're not standing on the word of God. They're not, confessing the faith, and they're not standing for truth in the public square. You can see it in business, and you see it in a lot of businesses that are promoting, whether it's REI with their co-op model, where we all have kind of share and we're all equals here. What are some examples you might pinpoint for people of this leftism in business, of organizations that are not thoroughly right wing will eventually become left wing over time?
Well, I think we can see this pretty much everywhere, right? Like all of these businesses that were supposed to be kind of American and pro family values, and conservatives just kind of assumed that business was kind of naturally on their side, right? Like if nothing else, it was pro the free market. and it was always kind of going to be there. But actually, it turns out the free market's not particularly good at maintaining hierarchies. Actually, it does quite the opposite. And so these businesses were already kind of naturally moving that direction. On top of that, of course, we saw the radicalization on college campuses. And I don't know if you remember, back when we started kind of getting the college rape crisis, those kind of narratives, and all of a sudden we had like these massive protests on college campuses and social justice, and people said, oh, that's just, it's just the hippies again, it's these kids, they're being silly, and eventually they'll have to grow up and get jobs, and they'll lose all this stuff. But of course, that's not what happened to the hippies, and it's not what happened to these people either. What happened is they moved their radical ideology from the colleges into the boardroom, and now these companies are filled with leftist commissars, radical leftist activists, and they are the ones driving things. Yeah, you might still have some of the old guard at the top, but they're really hostages to a lot of this kind of radical ideology, and they were already trending anyway this direction, right? Because the key thing is they all share the same culture, they all share the same progressive ideology, they went to the same colleges, they watch the same movies, they read the same books, they all kind of share this value system. This is the water in which they swim, in the same way that Christianity would have been the common language of somebody in the 1500s. And so you don't really have to do a lot of convincing to move these people leftward anyway. But the natural structure, the natural drift of wanting to be accepted, the natural truth is that power lies to the left. There's no power anymore in telling people, you got to get your stuff together, you have to live under a hierarchical system, you have to restrict your behavior. The power is all in, let's find a new strange sexual minority and wedge open and destroy all of tradition and all of what works and all the social norms so that these new people can have power. Disagreement, especially in a democratic system, is what actually generates political energy. And so whether it's inside a company or inside politics or inside a church, breaking down tradition is a good way to secure yourself personal power inside that organization. And that's why right-wing organizations tend to become left-wing over time.
And so an organization, if I'm running a business and I want it to be explicitly right wing, what does that mean? What do I need to do today to make that happen?
First, you need to maintain control of it. You cannot, if you're going public, or if you're setting up a lot of other boards, if you're delegating large amounts of authority, naturally, and we'll get to this in Law 3 because this is where this really comes in. But that squabble of bureaucracy is going to always pull your organization left wing. Second, you have to found it on explicitly hierarchical principles. This is what we do. This is who we are. We do not change it. These things are not up for debate. It is never a question of, ooh, the new social movement came in and now we need to implement. No, this is it. And then third, you must gatekeep. And this is very difficult, particularly in the United States, because it's kind of illegal to right-wing gatekeep. It's totally legal to left-wing gatekeep, by the way.
Yeah.
It's actually required by law. There are laws that require you to put leftists inside of your organization if it's above a certain size. So it's actually, businesses are legally required to in some way insert a fifth column inside of them and make them drift leftward. And so there's a difficulty, but it has to be overcome. We have to figure this out, of kind of figuring out how to gatekeep without being explicit about it. But you've got to find a way. You just can't hire people who hate you. It's really that simple. Like if you sit down with someone and they're sitting there with purple hair and a large amount of visible tattoos, and they're talking about the Black Lives Matter rally they had next weekend, you need to figure out a way to make sure they don't get hired. That's really all there is to it.
And it's not that complicated to do, because it's just a matter of differences and not a good fit at the company. When you talk about this fifth column in businesses and it being kind of instantiated by law to hire kind of left-wing progressives in companies, what are you talking about there?
I mean, we're required to meet certain diversity requirements. We're required to create HR departments. Those HR departments are basically just left-wing political enforcers. Everything that constitutes a hostile work environment is just left-wing. It's just when someone says this is a hostile work environment, what they're saying is there's not enough left-wing politics in this work environment. There's nothing like that on the right. Like, you can't be like, oh man, there's not enough jokes about atheists in this workplace, so I'm going to file a lawsuit because really like, that's not how it works.
Right.
The only way you create a hostile workplace is by not catering to the political priorities of leftists. Is this workplace feminist enough? Is this workplace LGBTQ friendly enough? Is this, does this workplace these are all things that code left-wing behavior, and you're required to care about them once your business is above a certain size. Which is why, it's funny. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Jeremy Boring of the Daily Wire. He was talking about that pride flag that showed up on the Chosen set, right?
Yeah.
He said, well, there's nothing they can do about it. They have to hire these people. They're required to by law. And it's like, yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting that even a production explicitly making a TV show about Jesus Christ can't keep a gay pride flag out of their production by law? What does that mean? It means our problems are not simply, well, you're not voting hard enough, or you're not working hard enough. These problems are deeply encoded in our law. It is built. Leftism has a systemic advantage that is core to every organization that must comply to it.
Yeah, just a practical example. If anyone watches The Office, I think of Michael Scott and Toby Flenderson and kind of the disagreement they have there. And my wife is always prone to feel bad for Toby, when Toby's made fun of. Like, why is Michael so hard on Toby? And it's like, no, Toby is the example of what we're talking about, where he's constantly policing. And Michael is kind of a caricature of somebody who wants to be in charge but doesn't know how to handle power well. He too much wants to be loved. But I think anyone who's in a big corporation sees this. I mean, with pronouns and emails and all this kind of thing, if you're going to get pronouns in an email, it's going to come from HR. These people are going to have the signals in there. They're going to say this company is on stolen land. They're going to do all the things that Oren's talking about here. Let's get to the third law. Talking about everything that's not right-wing is controlled by a cabal of its enemies. Is that how it goes?
It's the simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it's controlled by a cabal of its enemies. And this doesn't actually just have to be right-wing. This actually happens to left-wing organizations as well. So, for instance, you now have a lot of feminist organizations who are demanding that women refer to men who dress as women, right? So, like, feminist organizations, which were explicitly founded in theory to protect women, to fight for women's rights, are now destroying the lives of women so that men who want to be women and mock their very existence can act that way. So this doesn't just have to happen to right-wing organizations. This is just true in general. So the key thing here in this law is bureaucracy, right?
Okay.
Like we kind of hinted at in law 2. The key here is the principal actor problem. So if you have a business and you're the sole owner, you define what the business is, right? You run the ship. You get the profits. Its successes are its successes. Its failures are your failures. You are intimately tied to the costs and benefits of what you do. So everything you do is going to be incentivized based on, is it good for my business or not? Does it reach the goals I was looking for? Is my organization doing what it was supposed to do? Once you change to a bureaucratic structure, and all major companies at this point, all major churches, organizations are bureaucratic at this point. Once you change to a bureaucratic system, you change the incentive structure. So as the owner of the company, I care about profit. As a shareholder of a company, I care about profit. In theory, those that operate my bureaucracy run it under my my goals. They also want to maximize profit. But actually, that's not what advances your career as a bureaucrat. Bureaucrats don't gain or lose their job. They don't make more or less money based strictly on, is my company doing well? What they really want is power inside the organization. And what's the best way to generate power inside the organization if there's just power sitting around? Well, just like in a democracy, disagreement is the key. Anytime there's an unresolved disagreement, there's an opportunity to rule. There's an opportunity to step into that space and control it. So if a man is a man and everybody knows that a man is a man, there's no conflict over it, right? There's no political power or power inside my business to be acquired by that. But if a man could be a woman, well, now there's a disagreement. Now there are sides formed. Now there's an opportunity for me to wedge open difference and secure more power inside the organization. And so organizations that are not run by an individual, that are not tied directly to the consequences of their actions, tend to slowly but surely eat themselves from the inside. They tend to tear themselves apart because the different actors inside the organization become more interested in acquiring power inside the organization than they do in actually maintaining or advancing the stated mission of the organization. And this is why we can see corporations making and sticking by decisions. Look at somebody like Bud Light, right? They obviously destroyed themselves,
Right.
with kind of running this ad with Dylan Mulvaney and backing the whole trans stuff. That's not what their customers want. It's not what makes them money, but they're not doing anything about it, right? They're not ever going to issue an apology. Is it because they don't want to make money? Well, no, but it's because something more powerful than the profit motive is in control of the corporation. And so the corporation, which was supposed to be about selling beer and is supposed to be about making money, instead actually becomes about forwarding a political agenda. And it looks like it's being run by a cabal of its enemies. If you wanted to destroy Bud Light, what would you do? Could you come up with a plan better than plastering Dylan Mulvaney on the side of a Budweiser can? You probably couldn't.
Right.
And yet they did it voluntarily. And not only did they do it voluntarily, they're sticking by it.
They are, yeah.
Because they have to.
Yeah, it's crazy. One example and then one question on that. The question is going to pertain to like companies like BlackRock and how they become corrupt in this way. But a practical way I've seen this play out in churches as they move less hierarchical, more egalitarian. There's a big push for different fellowship groups, community groups, small groups, and what you see in business, the easy kind of transferable principle there that Oren's talking about is the power of the middle manager. The middle manager is looking to gain power, not looking to really advance the organization. Of course, everyone wants to hire a middle manager that's like super on board, but inevitably at the end of the day, that middle manager is still held back by the person at the top because they cannot replace them. And so they're searching for power. What happens is not only do people go into the workplace and experience this dynamic, unbeknownst to them sometimes, but then when they get in church, there's even a heightened sense of this where they will lead a small group or they'll lead a faction in the church. And if they can find people who are crying out, who have perceived slights, anything like that, disagreements, who want to improvise and tear down hierarchy, and it's like, what if we did this cool new thing and broke down tradition? They come in, they can gain power, and then all of a sudden you have a major church problem on your hands, lots of division, and you can't even as a pastor necessarily identify why, because it's very confusing, and that's part of the scheme of the enemy is to confuse things. You can't really argue with them on doctrine or like what's going on, because all they're trying to do is get power, and churches are very soft on this stuff. There's a soft underbelly in a lot of churches and non-denominational churches because they don't want to be perceived as traditional hierarchicalist. They want to be perceived as inclusive and welcoming. They want to be perceived in a certain way. And so they easily get taken out. I've seen many pastors get taken out. Churches get split over these middle managers, whether it's a ministry leader or something like that, who are more interested in power than they are interested in advancing the Great Commission, following the doctrine, advancing the cause of the church, submitting to their pastor, all these kind of things. So I think it plays out in churches a lot. That's why I found this really compelling. The question, though, that I have for you is like with an organization with BlackRock is the example I think of, who has embraced ESG and all this kind of stuff. They're advancing these social causes. So in my mind with Bud Light, if you look at their shareholders and all this kind of thing, BlackRock is a player. And so how high up does this go? Why is BlackRock even? How have they become controlled by a cabal of their enemies? Or, unless they are the leftist head that needs to be cut off, like what is going on there?
So that's a kind of a much larger issue that I don't know if we'll have time to kind of
Sure.
but I'll do my best to condense down the most relevant points. I have actually just completed a book explaining this, so
Great.
if people want to know, they can read the total state. It'll be coming out here hopefully soon. I just completed the manuscript, but so the kind of the back of the book version of this is we are in a situation where so the free market isn't really a thing, and it's captured almost entirely by investment firms like BlackRock, which if you look at pretty much every major corporation, BlackRock and I don't know why the other one is escaping me right now, the other massive hedge fund. Anyway, there's two hedge funds. BlackRock is one of them, and they can they capture solid interest in pretty much every major corporation you can think of. So really, actually, almost all of these corporations are owned by the same set of investors. We are in a crisis. Our entire society is built on a managerial apparatus, which is a little more difficult to get into as to kind of what that means. But basically, it means that we are all of our structures are bureaucratic in nature, and they need to expand, and they need to kind of homogenize our culture in order to kind of bring everything under the same kind of set of managerial kind of skill sets. However, we were kind of basing our entire society around efficiency of those organizations. We need those organizations to have increased efficiency so they have high amounts of production and consumption. But we are getting to the end of that. As you have probably noticed, all of those organizations tried to globalize, right? Globalization is a huge deal. But we are now to the point where like there's just no more efficiency to get out of these organizations. There's just no more ways in which managerialism can produce additional output, additional economic growth, increases in GDP, all those things that we have relied upon to kind of drive our society and our economy. And that means that basically they have to start scaling down expectations. People are living shorter lives for the first time in history. We're seeing generations of Americans realizing they're going to have worse lives than their parents did. That's just not something that had happened for a very long time in the United States. We just kind of assumed that things would get better forever, but they're not. And the reason is that we can't produce any more efficiency. Our system has broken down. And so all of these organizations need to kind of direct their goals away from increased efficiency, like output, economic output of what they do, and they need to like funnel that energy into something else. And the way to do that is the woke ideology. It is a progressive ideology. So yeah, we're not producing the number of widgets we used to, and we're not getting the same kind of profits, and we're not providing the same kind of services for our customer. But check out our ESG score. Check out the program we have to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look at all the numbers we have that show that we're the most tolerant, society. We promote trans kids, blah, blah, blah. All of these things become new metrics by which the managerial class can kind of feed itself, can kind of justify its existence. And so I think that's what we're seeing now. And I think that's why we're seeing so many companies and corporations, even the largest investors, now figuring out ways to almost scale back their production, scale back what they did, because they're just not able to produce the way they used to. They don't have the economic incentives anymore, and they need a new justification to keep kind of their power and the regime in place.
Okay, cool. Yeah, is the book was coming out soon? I assume.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the turnaround. It's the first time I've ever written a book, so I don't know what the turnaround time is on this.
Sure.
But I just finished the last chapter. I got to kind of spruce up a few things, and then we'll go through the editing process. But hopefully it'll be soon.
That's
I don't
great.
know.
Well, once it comes out, we got to get you back on the show to talk about that. The last question I had for you before I let you go is this: there's a really sad bent among many Christians and just generally conservatives, where when an attack is launched on them, when they go, "You're not a tolerant person, you're not a kind person," from the left, they want to immediately prove that they are. Is that a viable strategy to engage these accusations? And if not, what should we do instead?
No, it's not, for two reasons. One is that Christianity is not primarily about tolerance. There's a lot of things that Christianity doesn't tolerate and shouldn't tolerate and can't tolerate while still being Christianity. That doesn't mean that the church should be closing its doors to people. That doesn't mean that it should not be seeking the salvation of everyone. It doesn't mean that God's love is not available to all of these different people. But it does mean that entering the church, that does mean restriction. It does mean a lack of tolerance for certain things. And so when someone attacks you for being intolerant of something, you should just remind them that Jesus was also very intolerant of many things. If someone would cause a child to stumble, Christ wasn't very he was pretty particular about what the solution to that problem was,
Right.
and it was not a lot of therapy,
Right.
actually. But that seems to be the way that churches have, like you said, they want to read that modern understanding of justice into these things. Well, no, actually, that's not how you're supposed to approach that issue at all. Hopefully, people are repenting of that behavior. But in the meantime, like, that doesn't mean you tolerate it. And Christ was very clear about, how you shouldn't do that. So I think the first thing is just to understand that that all religions are defined by what they don't allow, and Christianity, of course, is also one of those religions that is defined by what it does not allow. But the second thing is that this is just a weak way to argue with people. No one on the left is telling you you're intolerant and then they'll see you tolerant and then they'll love you.
Yeah.
They'll just demand the next thing from you because they don't really care about the things you're not tolerant about. At its core, progressivism wants to destroy hierarchy, and you are a hierarchy. And so they want to dismantle the hierarchy. They don't care about, one specific aspect. And once that one specific aspect is gone, all of a sudden everyone will follow Christ and become believers. No, they just want to destroy you. And so conceding to them, everyone understands this when it comes to Hitler, right? Like everyone mocks peace in our times at this point, right? They understand that policy of appeasement does not work. But for some reason, then you travel to the church and all of a sudden, like, that understanding disappears. The people who are it's difficult for us to believe this because we don't like this in the modern day, but it's just true. There are people who are for your existential destruction. They want to end your way of life. They want to end your belief system. They want to make it irrelevant. They don't want it to have any sway over anyone because it competes for power against them. And every time you give them an inch, they will take the next mile. So just never give them an inch in the first place. Stick with what God says, stick with what the Bible says, stick to the tradition of your church, and you'll be in a much better shape than trying to kowtow to people who hate you anyway.
Amen to that. That's great, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Aaron. This was a great conversation.
No, absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Foolproof Theology, where we had a conversation with Auron MacIntyre. I hope you enjoyed this content. If you did, give it a great rating on iTunes or wherever podcasts are found. Subscribe and share it wherever you can. Maybe you can start a great conversation with a friend or a family member who thinks politically, and y'all can have a great conversation by sharing this episode. I also wanted to make sure you knew about our Patreon, where we have exclusive content. You can help me provide show content, and you can also get some swag when you sign up at $5 a month on the Patreon. Head over to the link in the show notes to sign up on the Patreon so that I can keep bringing you great content like this interview with Auron MacIntyre. See you next time.